All right, so today we're going deep on some pretty big moves happening over in the UK.
Yeah.
When it comes to things like defense, their whole approach to like welfare and benefits and all of that stuff.
Yeah, a lot going on.
Yeah, and it's all kind of I guess spurred by this BBC newscast we were looking at,
Right.
where you had these journalists from like the Financial Times and Bloomberg, really digging into these issues. And
Yeah.
it feels like there's some serious shifts underway, and we want to kind of like suss out, what's the strategy here,
Absolutely.
and what could it mean for for the average person over there.
It is fascinating, right? Because you've got the prime minister,
Yeah.
standing on a nuclear submarine,
Right.
which is an image that's hard to miss. And then you've got these proposed changes to the benefit system,
Yeah.
all happening as the economy's kind of wobbling a bit.
Right.
So there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so let's start with that image of the PM, on the submarine, because that felt deliberate, right? It's not every day you see a world leader, posing with, weapons of mass destruction. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, that was a very carefully crafted message, I think.
yeah.
What they're trying to do is project strength on two fronts.
Okay.
On one hand, you've got the international stage, right? Ukraine is still going on,
Yeah.
and the UK wants to look like a reliable player.
Right.
But then you've got the domestic audience
Mm-hmm.
who are feeling the squeeze from the economy.
Yeah.
So they're trying to link those two ideas.
So it's like saying, hey, we're strong abroad and that strength will protect you at home kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about making people feel secure on both levels. And that visit to Barrow-in-Furness was really key for this.
Okay. Remind me what was happening in Barrow-in-Furness.
So that's where they build a lot of the, the big defense stuff, like the submarines.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And the message there was all about jobs.
Okay.
Investing in defense creates these highly skilled jobs that are going to be around for a long time.
Like apprenticeships and all that.
Yeah, it's exactly. Like shipbuilding, welding, all these things that has been, kind of lost in recent decades.
Right.
So it's trying to tie national security to economic security.
It's a clever link, but I mean, is the money really there? Our sources had some doubts about this big defense spending increase.
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little tricky.
Okay.
So they're talking about an extra £6 billion over 2 years.
Right. Which sounds
like a lot.
Yeah, a huge amount of money.
But the analysts we looked at, they're saying a good chunk of that might just be filling holes in the existing budget.
Oh, so not actually buying like, new shiny weapons.
Not necessarily. It's
Yeah.
more like keeping the lights on, making sure existing projects don't get scrapped.
So more like maintaining than upgrading.
Yeah, that's the concern. And the defense industry, they need more than promises. They need orders.
Right, because they have to like tool up and hire people and...
Exactly. They need to invest in capacity, build that pipeline of
Yeah.
skilled workers. And that takes time.
years, probably.
Absolutely. You can't just flip a switch and suddenly have a workforce ready to build, a new generation of fighter jets.
Right, and it doesn't sound like this pressure to spend more on defense is going away anytime soon.
No, not at all. If anything, it's going to increase.
Hmm.
And that raises a big question for the UK. How are they going to pay for all this?
Yeah, especially with everything else that's going on.
Right, because the government already dipped into the overseas aid budget for this initial increase.
Right.
And that's not something they can keep doing politically.
No, it'll cause a huge backlash.
So where does the money come from? That's the big question.
Okay, so defense is one piece of this puzzle. Now let's talk Ukraine, because it seems like the UK is rethinking its role there.
Yeah, they're talking about maybe shifting away from boots on the ground
Right.
and focusing more on helping Ukraine with air and sea defense.
And why is that?
Well, a couple of things. First, the U.S. situation is uncertain.
Right. New administration, new priorities.
Exactly. And then you've got Russia. They've made it very clear they don't want European troops in Ukraine.
Right, and sending in a big ground force, that's a huge commitment.
It is. It's logistically difficult, politically risky.
Yeah.
So this meeting they had at Northwood.
That's like their military HQ, right?
Yeah, that was all about figuring out, okay, if we're not sending in ground troops, how do we help Ukraine defend its skies and its coastline?
So it's like taking that political idea and turning it into actual military plans.
Exactly. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
What if the U.S. and Russia strike some kind of deal?
Uh-oh.
And that deal doesn't take into account all this planning that Europe is doing.
That's a problem.
It is, because then Europe might be left holding the bag, having prepared for a scenario that never materializes.
And that kind of gets to the bigger question of, can Europe actually defend itself without the U.S.?
Right. Can they really project power on that scale without American support? That's a huge unknown.
Yeah, that's a bit worrying. Okay, so Ukraine has obviously been a big deal for, global security, but it's also had this weird effect on the UK's relationship with the EU.
Yeah, it's this strange paradox.
Mm.
On one hand, the crisis has forced them to cooperate more on security.
Because they're all facing the same threat?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then the EU goes and creates this massive defense fund.
Yeah, 150 billion euros, right?
Yeah, and they specifically exclude the UK.
And other non-EU countries, right?
Yeah, which seems counterproductive when you need everyone on board.
So what's going on there?
Well, you can't escape the Brexit baggage, right?
Right.
There's still a lot of tension there.
Okay.
And then you got the UK-France rivalry.
Those two never seem to get along.
No, it's like a historical thing.
And France is basically saying, hey, if you want to play with us on defense, you got to sort out these other Brexit issues first.
Like what?
Like fishing rights.
Seriously. They're holding security hostage over fishing quotas.
It does seem a bit strange, right?
Yeah, it's like as there was a war on, can we focus?
But that's the situation. And it leaves a gap that someone else might fill.
Oh, yeah, we heard something about Canada getting involved. Yeah, Canada's been making some interesting noises. They're looking to strengthen ties with Europe on defense.
And they don't have the same baggage as the UK.
No, Brexit doesn't hang over them.
Yeah.
And they've also got this potential opening with fighter jet contracts.
Okay, explain that.
So Canada was going to buy American jets, but they're having second thoughts.
And they might look to Europe instead.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And that could be a big win for European defense companies.
Interesting. So Canada stepping in where the UK has been sidelined.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked defense, we've talked Ukraine. Now let's completely switch gears.
Okay, hit me.
Welfare reform. This is another area where the UK government is making some big moves.
Yeah. They're talking about some pretty radical changes to the benefit system, right?
They are. And the stated goal is two things. One, save money.
Right, because the benefits bill is huge.
It is.
Yeah.
And it keeps growing.
Yeah.
And two, they want to get more people into work.
And their argument is that the current system is actually preventing some people from working.
Right. They're saying that for some people, it's actually more beneficial to stay on benefits than to get a job.
Because the benefits are too generous or...
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah.
But it's a controversial claim. There's not a ton of evidence to support it.
So what are they actually proposing to do?
Well, a couple of big things. They're going to make it harder for some people to claim disability benefits.
Okay.
Tighten the criteria, make the process more difficult. And then this is the really controversial one.
Okay.
They want to make it impossible for some people under 22 to claim benefits at all.
Wow, that's a big change.
It is. And it's causing a lot of anxiety. You know, people worried about destitution, homelessness, even suicide.
Yeah, that's a serious concern.
It is. And it's not just coming from the opposition. You've got people within the government's own party who are deeply uncomfortable with this.
So it's causing a lot of division.
Yeah, and it's feeding into this narrative that the government is shifting to the right.
Like we saw with the cuts to overseas aid.
Exactly. It's all part of the same pattern. And these reforms are still in the early stages.
Right, they have to go through Parliament and all that.
Exactly. First there's a green paper, then a white paper, then legislation. And given the level of opposition, it's not guaranteed to sail through.
No, especially with elections coming up.
Right. Legal councils are already pushing back. They're worried about the impact on their communities.
But the government is trying to frame this as a necessary evil, right?
They are.
Yeah.
They're saying, look, the benefits bill is out of control. We have to do something.
And there is a genuine concern about people taking advantage of the system.
Right. There's this perception that some people are abusing it, even if there's not a lot of evidence to support that.
And the government is tapping into that.
They are. They're trying to connect with voters who are feeling squeezed and who are maybe skeptical of welfare.
So it's a political calculation as much as an economic one?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's important to note they're not actually talking about cutting the benefits bill overall.
Just slowing its growth.
Right. Their goal is to stabilize it, make it more sustainable in the long term.
Okay, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But speaking of the long term, we also have this whole economic picture to consider.
Right. And that's not looking too rosy at the moment.
No, I've seen reports about potential spending cuts across other government departments.
Yeah, the word is they're looking at cuts of up to 7%.
Wow.
For everything except health and defense.
Which are obviously priorities.
Right. But that still leaves a lot of areas facing a squeeze.
And this is where that whole austerity argument comes back.
Exactly. Labor's going to hammer them on this.
Because they promised to end austerity.
Yeah, so this plays right into their hands.
So how's the government going to counter that?
Well, you're going to point to all the money they're putting into capital spending.
Like infrastructure projects and things.
Exactly. They'll say, look, we're investing in the future, not just cutting back.
And they'll try to shift the focus away from individual departments.
Right. They'll talk about overall spending levels, try to paint a more positive picture.
And what about taxes? Any chance they'll unfreeze those tax thresholds?
Don't hold your breath. That's been a huge point of contention, but it doesn't look like they're budging.
So basically everyone's going to be paying more tax.
Pretty much. But the big elephant in the room is economic growth.
Right, because that was the government's big promise.
It was. They
Yeah.
said they were going to get the economy moving again.
And how's that going?
Not great. The forecasts are pretty grim.
Because of interest rates?
Yeah. High interest rates, the cost of servicing the debt, all that stuff is dragging the economy down.
And there are doubts about the government's whole strategy, right?
Yeah, some people are saying that all this capital spending might actually be crowding out private investment.
Which would be counterproductive.
Totally. And there's just a general lack of dynamism in the economy. Businesses aren't investing. People aren't spending.
So it's a bit of a mess.
It's not ideal,
Yeah.
but there is a glimmer of hope.
Okay, tell me.
Some of the less flashy stuff they're doing, like planning reform, that could have a positive impact in the long run.
But not right away.
No, it's more of a slow burn. But it could help to boost growth eventually.
So what's the headline message going to be in the spring statement?
Get ready to hear a lot of, the world has changed.
Meaning?
Meaning we can't do things the way we used to. We're in a new reality, and we need a new approach.
Which is convenient because it lets them justify all sorts of things.
Exactly. It's a way to deflect criticism and say, look, we're just adapting to the situation.
But it does highlight how everything's connected, right?
Absolutely. You can't separate defense from welfare from the economy. It's all one big system.
And decisions in one area have knock-on effects everywhere else.
Exactly. So what happens when you increase defense spending, but cut other departments? How does that impact people's lives? How does welfare reform affect the workforce?
Yeah, big questions.
And the truth is, we don't have all the answers yet. The long-term consequences of these policies are still very uncertain.
So as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you want our listeners to think about?
Think about these connections we've been talking about. Think about how these different areas of policy interact and how they're going to shape the UK's future.
Because ultimately it's about people's lives, right?
It is. It's about jobs, security, opportunity. All those things are at stake.
A lot to ponder then.
Yeah.
Lots to ponder.
Well, thanks for breaking it all down for us. You've given us a lot to think about.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure to dive deep.
Until next time, then.
See ya. Bye.